My son looked me straight in the eyes inside Istanbul airport, smiled like nothing was wrong, took my passport wallet to make security easier, then disappeared into the crowd. 30 seconds later, my boarding pass stopped working. My phone was locked. My credit cards were frozen. I was 63 years old alone in a foreign country, and I finally understood that my own son had planned this. You never expect betrayal to feel quiet. People imagine screaming matches or fists through drywall, but real betrayal, it usually happens while strangers are buying coffee. Little kids are chasing each other through terminals, and somebody's rolling a suitcase over polished tile like it's any other Tuesday. That's exactly how it happened. I just stood there staring at the departure board, trying to convince myself there had to be some mistake. "There must be a problem with your boarding pass, sir," the Turkish Airlines gate agent said politely. "There has to be." She scanned it again. Nothing. "I'm sorry." I reached for my phone to pull up the confirmation email. Face ID didn't work. My banking app wanted a password I'd never memorized because Ethan had insisted on helping me manage everything after I retired. "No problem," I told him back in Indiana. "You understand this stuff better than I do." Funny how those words kept echoing in my head. I searched every pocket. No wallet, no passport holder, nothing. Just my reading glasses and the little bottle of arthritis pills I always carried. I looked around. "Ethan." No answer. I called louder. "Ethan." Families kept walking around me. Nobody even looked up. For about 10 minutes, I honestly believed he'd gotten lost. Then I noticed something. The gate had already started boarding, and my son was nowhere nearby. I hurried toward the counter. "My son's already on that flight." The gate agent checked her screen. "It appears he boarded approximately 12 minutes ago." 12? She nodded. "He boarded alone." Alone. That word landed harder than anything else she'd said. A week earlier, we'd been standing in my driveway in Carmel, Indiana, loading luggage into the SUV. It was supposed to be our first father-son vacation in years. A Mediterranean cruise, Italy, Greece, Turkey. I'd paid for everything. Not because Ethan couldn't afford it. He made more money than I ever had. He flipped commercial properties around Indianapolis and constantly talked about leverage equity cash flow and tax strategies that sounded like another language to me. I paid because I wanted time with my boy. Simple as that. After my wife Linda died 8 years ago, life got smaller. The house stayed clean because nobody messed it up anymore. The television stayed off most evenings. Christmas dinners became shorter. Retirement wasn't nearly as peaceful as people imagine. Your body slows down. Your knees hurt climbing stairs. Friends start talking about medications instead of vacations. Then every few months, another obituary shows up in your mailbox. You realize time isn't speeding up. You're just running out of it. When Ethan suggested taking a trip together, I thought maybe we were finally finding each other again. Turns out we weren't. Looking back, the warning signs started before we even reached Chicago O'Hare. "You really need those orthopedic shoes. They help. They make you look 80. "I'm 63. "Exactly." He laughed. I laughed too. That's what fathers do. We convince ourselves little insults don't matter. On the cruise, he criticized almost everything. I walked too slowly. I tipped too much. I asked too many questions during guided tours. I wanted coffee instead of cocktails. "You sound old," he'd tell me. Well, I was old. What exactly was I supposed to sound like? Still, I let it slide. Every time. The real fight happened 2 nights before we flew home. We were sitting outside a seafood restaurant overlooking the Bosphorus. The sunset was beautiful. I barely noticed. Ethan slid several documents across the table. "I've been meaning to ask you something." I adjusted my glasses. "What is it, just estate planning?" I frowned. "I already have a will." "This is different." He spoke the way real estate people always seem to speak, fast, confident, like every decision has an expiration date. "If you put the house into a different structure now, it'll save taxes later." I don't know enough about that. You don't have to. I'd like Harold to look at it. Harold Benson had been my best friend for 40 years, retired banker, never rushed anything. Ethan sighed loudly. "Dad, Harold's retired. So am I." He didn't smile. "It just needs your signature. I'll wait until I get home." "You don't trust me?" There it was, the oldest trap in the world. Trust. I looked him squarely in the face. "It's not about trust." "Then sign." "No." He leaned back in his chair. "You know what your problem is. I'm sure you're about to tell me. You think everybody's trying to steal from you." I laughed. "No, son. I think everybody should read before signing." His jaw tightened. Dinner ended 5 minutes later. Neither of us spoke during the taxi ride back to the hotel. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened, bought me coffee, asked if my knees were feeling better, even carried one of my bags. I remember thinking maybe we'd both cooled off. Now standing alone inside Istanbul airport, I realized he'd simply changed tactics. I walked to an information desk. I need help. The young employee spoke excellent English. I've lost my passport. We can contact the U.S. consulate. My wallet's gone too. I'm sorry. My son has it. She blinked. Your son, I think. Even saying those words sounded ridiculous. Who abandons their own father overseas? I sat near a coffee stand because my legs suddenly felt weak. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the terminal. People laughed. Announcements echoed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried. Life kept moving. Mine had stopped. I rested my elbows on my knees and stared at the floor. That's when a woman's voice quietly interrupted my thoughts. Excuse me. I looked up. She was around my age. Silver hair pulled neatly behind her shoulders. Simple navy blazer. No flashy jewelry except a wedding band she still wore despite obvious widowhood. Her posture reminded me of executives I'd delivered packages to during my UPS years. Confident without trying to prove anything. She sat beside me. Please don't ask questions, I frowned. What? She slipped her arm gently through mine. Just pretend you're my husband. I honestly wondered if I'd finally passed out from stress. I'm sorry. My driver's almost here. Before I could answer, two men in expensive suits walked toward us, scanning the seating area. The woman smiled warmly at me. One of the men made eye contact. She rested her hand over mine. The two men immediately exchanged glances and turned around without saying a word. She let out a slow breath. Thank you. What was that? I'll explain. She studied my face for a moment. Then she asked softly, now tell me something. What happened to you? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time all day, I couldn't pretend I was okay anymore. The woman waited without pressing me. That helped. There are moments when kindness makes you talk and moments when it makes you shut down because you're afraid the first honest sentence will pull everything else out with it. I was somewhere in between. My son left me here, I finally said. Her expression didn't change, but her hand tightened slightly around mine. He took my passport. My wallet too. Canceled my ticket. On purpose, I don't know what else to call it. She looked past me toward the departure board. Where are you trying to go, Indianapolis? And your son? Probably halfway to Chicago by now. I gave a little laugh, but it came out dry and ugly. The woman studied me for another second, then stood. Come with me. I don't even know your name. Victoria Hale, Jack Mercer. Good. Now we're not strangers. That's not how strangers work. For the first time, she smiled. Fair point. She led me through the terminal at a brisk pace that my knees didn't appreciate. I did my best to keep up without limping too noticeably. We reached a private exit where a black Mercedes van waited outside. A driver in a charcoal suit opened the rear door. Mrs. Hale. Emre, this is Mr. Mercer. He's coming with us. The driver didn't blink. Yes, ma'am. I paused beside the van. I appreciate the offer, but I really should contact the consulate. You should, Victoria said. And we will. You currently have no identification, no money, and no working phone. So yes, I wasn't used to being managed. I'd spent 35 years solving problems for other people. At UPS, I could look at a loading schedule and tell you where the bottleneck would happen before the first truck backed in. I had trained supervisors half my age and calm drivers twice my size. Now I couldn't buy a bottle of water. That realization hurt more than I expected. Victoria noticed me staring at the ground. You're not helpless, Jack. I feel pretty close. You were robbed by someone you trusted. That's different. The ride took us along the Bosphorus past stone walls, crowded sidewalks, and apartment buildings rising behind lines of plane trees. Istanbul looked beautiful in the late afternoon light. I resented it for being beautiful. Victoria's villa stood behind a white wall on a quiet street in Arnavutköy. It wasn't a palace exactly, but it was close enough that I felt ridiculous walking inside in wrinkled khakis and orthopedic shoes. A housekeeper brought tea and a plate of warm bread, olives, and cheese. I ate too fast. Victoria pretended not to notice. Once I'd slowed down, she called someone from her office and arranged contact with the U.S. consulate. Then she handed me a spare phone. Call someone at home. I knew exactly who. Harold answered on the second ring. Jack, hearing his voice, nearly finished me. Yeah. Where the hell are you? Ethan said you changed your plans. I'm still in Istanbul. There was silence. What do you mean still? I explained it in pieces. Harold interrupted only once. He took your passport. Yes. That little Harold. I was going to say criminal. No, you weren't. I was working toward it. That almost made me smile. I asked him to check my house and call my bank first thing in the morning. I'll do it now, he said. It's afternoon there, and bankers only commit evil before lunch, retired bankers especially. He told me to stay where I was and call again when I knew more. When I hung up, Victoria was watching me. Good friend, best one I've got. Then perhaps your son hasn't isolated you as completely as he thinks. That sentence bothered me. Why do you keep talking like this was planned? Because impulsive people shout. They storm off. They don't cancel flights, freeze cards, and remove passports without thinking ahead. I didn't want her to be right. A few minutes later, a woman in her 30s entered, carrying a laptop and wearing the kind of expression that could bill by the hour. This is my daughter, Grace. Grace shook my hand but didn't sit. Mother says you need legal help. I need a passport. You may need more than that. She opened the laptop. Do you know whether your son had access to your email? Yes. Bank accounts? Yes. Retirement accounts. I hesitated, some of them. Grace looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at me. Nobody said anything for a moment. Grace pulled up a chair. Mr. Mercer, I'm going to ask direct questions. It's not personal. At this point, I'd welcome personal. That earned the faintest lift at the corner of her mouth. We spent the next hour rebuilding my life from memory. Bank names, account types, property records, security questions, former addresses, my mother's maiden name, the make of my first car. I felt less like a man and more like evidence. Grace found my home deed online, still in my name. That was the first good news. Then she found a recorded mortgage filed 3 months earlier. My stomach tightened. That can't be right. Grace turned the screen toward me. The document showed my address, my name, and a signature that looked very much like mine. A home equity line for $480,000. I never took that out. Did you sign estate documents recently? Grace asked. Not in Turkey. Before that. I remembered Ethan coming over in March with a stack of papers and a box of glazed donuts from Titus Bakery. He'd said they were routine updates after I changed beneficiaries on an old life insurance policy. I signed where he pointed. I didn't read every page. My face must have changed because Victoria leaned forward. What do you remember, donuts? Grace stared at me. Donuts. He brought donuts. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. That's almost insulting. It worked, I said. The room went quiet. Grace searched another database, then another. She found transfers from one of my retirement accounts into a limited liability company tied to an apartment project Ethan owned near Fisher's. $200,000, then another $75,000. My hands started shaking. I pressed them against my knees. I gave him permission to help consolidate accounts. Did you give him permission to invest the money? Grace asked. No. Did you authorize personal loans? No. Did you sign a broad financial power of attorney? I don't know. That was the worst answer. Not, no, not yes. I don't know. I had spent my entire working life checking labels, tracking numbers, and correcting other people's mistakes. Yet I'd handed my son legal control because I didn't want him thinking I was stubborn or suspicious. I stood too quickly. Pain shot through my right knee. Victoria caught my elbow before I hit the table. I need air. She walked me onto the terrace. Below us, fairy lights moved across the dark water. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then I said I raised him better than this. Maybe you did. That doesn't make sense. Parents provide values. Children still make choices. I rubbed both hands over my face. He's my only son. I know. I can't destroy him. Victoria's voice stayed calm. Stopping him isn't destroying him. Before I could answer, the spare phone rang. Harold, I put it on speaker. Jack, he said, breathing hard. I'm outside your house. What happened? There's a locksmith here. My chest went cold, Harold continued. And Ethan's standing in your driveway telling everyone you're no longer capable of handling your own affairs. I barely slept that night. Not because of the time difference. Because every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Ethan standing in my driveway, telling neighbors I wasn't capable of managing my own life. That hurt more than losing the money. If someone steals your savings, they take your future. If they convince people you've lost your mind, they take your dignity. At 63, dignity becomes harder to replace. The next morning, Grace was already sitting at the dining table with 3 laptops open. Victoria was reading emails over coffee. She slid a mug toward me. Black. Harold said that's how you drink it. I looked at her. You called Harold, he called me. I don't even know your phone number. He found it. That sounded exactly like Harold. Grace didn't look up. The consulate has your emergency passport ready this afternoon. That's fast. Victoria shrugged. I made a few calls. I had stopped asking exactly who she knew. Every answer only made me realize how different our worlds were. Still, despite the beautiful house and expensive coffee, I couldn't stop thinking about home. My house. Linda's flower beds. The old maple tree we'd planted the year Ethan started kindergarten. I suddenly remembered the pencil marks inside the hallway closet where we'd measured Ethan's height every birthday. If he sold that house, those marks would disappear forever. Victoria seemed to read my face. We're going back. When? This evening. I thought you had meetings. I do. In Chicago. In Indianapolis. I stared at her. You planned those? No, she smiled. But the timing is convenient. 20 hours later, we landed at O'Hare. The familiar smell of coffee, pretzels, and airport carpet somehow felt comforting. America. Home. Grace rented an SUV. Victoria insisted on sitting in the back with me instead of taking the front passenger seat. You look nervous. I am. What worries you most? I thought about it. That Ethan will look relieved instead of guilty. Victoria nodded slowly. Sometimes that's exactly what happens. The drive from Chicago to Carmel felt longer than ever before. Cornfields rolled past, gas stations, truck stops, churches with white steeples. Everything looked exactly the same. I wasn't. By the time we reached my neighborhood, the sun was setting. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the place until I saw Mrs. Donnelly watering her roses across the street. She spotted my SUV. Her mouth literally fell open. Jack! I stepped out. Hi, Carol. She hurried across the street. Oh my goodness. She hugged me so tightly my back popped. Ethan said... She stopped herself. What did Ethan say? Her face turned bright red. He said, well... Go ahead. He said you were having memory problems. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. He said doctors in Europe were keeping you longer. Harold stepped out from my garage before I could answer. He looked exactly like he always had. Khaki shorts, polo shirt tucked in too neatly, reading glasses hanging around his neck. He wrapped me in a hug. I ought to knock your son into next week. I know. I won't. I know. But I'd enjoy thinking about it. That sounded more like Harold. He quietly handed me a folder. I've been busy. Inside were copies of county filings, mortgage records, property transfers, bank notices. The deeper I looked, the sicker I felt. Harold pointed toward the driveway. Your house is still yours. For now, he nodded. For now. Grace spread everything across my kitchen table. The kitchen still smelled faintly like Linda's cinnamon candles. I almost expected her to walk in carrying groceries. Instead, there were legal documents. Grace adjusted her glasses. Mr. Mercer. Jack. Jack. She tapped one page. This isn't just financial abuse. What is it? Your son had you sign a durable financial power of attorney. I rubbed my forehead. I remember signing something. He told you it was estate planning. Yes. She nodded. He omitted one important detail. What? It became effective immediately. I looked toward Harold. So Ethan legally gained authority to manage almost every financial decision. Then none of this is illegal. Grace shook her head. Not necessarily. Hope disappeared almost instantly. She continued. Power of attorney creates responsibility. I frowned. He must act in your best interest. Harold smiled. That's the part your boy forgot. Grace pulled up another file. We've traced several transfers. She highlighted dates. Retirement funds, home equity, insurance cash values. Then she opened another document. An LLC, Mercer Horizon Development. Manager, Ethan Mercer. The money hadn't disappeared. It had funded one of Ethan's commercial developments. What is this building? Grace zoomed in. A mixed-use retail project in Fishers. Harold laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. I know that project. You do. The financing's collapsing. Grace looked up. What? Harold leaned back. Half the tenants backed out. No kidding. The banks have been nervous for months. I looked between them. So, Grace finished my sentence. If that project fails, Harold quietly nodded. Your retirement money goes with it. The room became painfully quiet. Victoria hadn't said a word since we sat down. Now she finally spoke. I'd like the project address. Grace handed it over. Victoria typed something into her phone. Less than 30 seconds later, it rang. She answered. Hello, Michael. She walked toward the back porch. Harold leaned close. Who exactly is she? I honestly don't know. She's definitely richer than me. I figured that out. And smarter. I figured that out too. When Victoria returned, she looked thoughtful. Interesting. What? My company has been reviewing that property. Harold blinked. What? Grace looked surprised. You never mentioned that. It wasn't important. She turned toward me. Until now. What does that mean? It means I already know Ethan's lenders. I frowned. And they're worried. About what? Cash flow. She folded her arms. Your son isn't nearly as successful as he wants everyone to believe. That explains something. The expensive watches, luxury SUV, country club membership. The constant pressure to refinance my house. It wasn't greed alone. It was panic. My phone buzzed. An unknown Indiana number. I answered. Hello. Silence. Then Ethan. So. I didn't answer. I heard you made it home. I did. You should have called. You canceled my ticket. You overreacted. I actually laughed. Overreacted? I just needed time. You needed my retirement. Don't start. You emptied my accounts. They're investments. They're mine. He lowered his voice. Dad. What? If you cooperate? There it is. What? The real reason you called. He sighed. The project's temporary. I've heard temporary before. I can fix this. You had your chance. His voice hardened. If you fight me, I'll what? You'll lose everything. I looked through the kitchen window. Victoria stood quietly watching me. Not interfering, just listening. I spoke calmly. No, Ethan. I already lost everything. Then I hung up. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Finally, Harold broke the silence. I've waited 20 years to hear you hang up on him. I smiled despite myself. So have I. Grace's laptop chimed. She looked down, then frowned. I think we've got something. What? She slowly turned the screen toward us. There are active negotiations involving Ethan's project. Victoria glanced at it, then looked at me. They're negotiating with Hale Global Logistics. I blinked. Your company, she nodded. I wasn't planning to buy it. She paused. But now, a slow smile crossed her face. I'd very much like to see exactly how honest your son has been with his investors. The morning after Ethan called, I woke up in my own bed for the first time in almost 2 weeks. Normally, waking up at home brought me peace. Not that morning. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar hum of the air conditioner and the robins outside my bedroom window. Everything looked exactly as Linda and I had left it. Her favorite quilt still covered the bed. The little clock radio she'd insisted on keeping for 20 years still sat on her nightstand. But the feeling had changed. For the first time since she died, my home no longer felt unquestionably safe. I made coffee the way I always did. 2 scoops, 1 mug, no sugar. As I stood by the kitchen window, I noticed something odd. A black SUV had parked across the street. 5 minutes later, it drove away. Harold walked in through the back door without knocking, carrying a white bakery box. I brought donuts. I laughed. Really? I figured we ought to replace the bad memory. He opened the box. Titus Bakery, apple fritters, chocolate long johns. The exact same bakery Ethan had brought donuts from the day he'd convinced me to sign those documents. Harold held one up. Read everything before accepting free pastries. I think that's excellent legal advice. For the first time in days, we both laughed until our sides hurt. It didn't erase anything, but it reminded me I was still capable of laughing. That mattered. Around 9, Grace arrived carrying another stack of files. Victoria followed a few minutes later with coffee from a little shop downtown. I didn't know whether you preferred Starbucks or local. Local, I answered. Always, she smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. We gathered around my dining room table, the same table where Linda had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for nearly 30 years. Now it looked like a law office. Folders, property maps, financial statements, bank correspondence. Grace pointed to a timeline she'd created. We're building 2 cases. 2, civil and potentially criminal. I looked uncomfortable. I don't want to send my son to prison. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Victoria spoke. Jack, that's not your decision. It feels like it is. You didn't create the situation. I raised him. You raised a little boy. She paused. The man making these choices is 36 years old. I rubbed my temples. I keep wondering where I went wrong. Harold leaned back. You want my honest opinion? I asked. You didn't go wrong. I must have. You loved him after Linda died. I did. You spoiled him sometimes. I know. You also worked overtime, coached Little League, paid for Purdue, helped with his first condo? He shrugged. At some point, responsibility changes addresses. I sat quietly. Part of me wanted Harold to be wrong, because if he was right, then there wasn't some hidden parenting mistake I could fix. There was only reality. Grace cleared her throat. I spoke with an elder financial abuse specialist this morning. I looked up. They've seen this before. They have, more often than you'd think. That surprised me. She continued. Adult children sometimes convince aging parents they're helping with finances. They gain legal authority. They isolate the parent. They slowly redirect assets. None of it sounded dramatic. That made it scarier. Grace wasn't describing monsters. She was describing ordinary people making terrible choices, just like Ethan. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed again. Melissa, my daughter-in-law. I stared at the screen. Victoria noticed. Who's Melissa? Ethan's wife. Answer. I stepped onto the back porch. Hello. Her voice sounded exhausted. Jack. Yes. I'm so sorry. For what? For everything. She started crying. I didn't know. What didn't you know? I knew Ethan was borrowing money, but not from me. No. She sniffled. He told me you'd invested willingly. I didn't. I figured that out. She lowered her voice. He's been sleeping maybe 3 hours a night. I don't care. I know. But I think you should know why. I stayed quiet. The Fishers project is failing. I've heard. He borrowed against everything. He borrowed against me. I know. She hesitated. I found emails. What kind? He changed dates. My heart skipped. Dates, documents. She took another shaky breath. I think he altered paperwork after you signed. That was different. Very different. Power of attorney might explain moving money. Changing legal documents afterward crossed another line. Can you prove it? I forwarded everything to Grace. You know Grace. She called me yesterday. I smiled despite myself. Of course she had. Grace didn't seem like the kind of attorney who waited for people to volunteer evidence. Melissa spoke again. I don't think my marriage survives this. I didn't know what to say. After a long silence, I finally answered honestly. I'm sorry. So am I. She hung up. When I walked back inside, Grace already had the emails open. She looked up. This helps. How much? A lot. She enlarged one attachment. Metadata, timestamps, revision history. I think he edited signature pages. Harold whistled softly. That changes things. Victoria remained unusually quiet. She simply watched all of us. Eventually I asked, what are you thinking? That desperation makes intelligent people careless. The next several days became strangely busy. Instead of sitting around feeling sorry for myself, I found myself helping Victoria's logistics team. Her company had temporarily leased warehouse space outside Indianapolis while negotiating several Midwest contracts. One afternoon, I visited one of the facilities. Old habits returned immediately. I noticed pallets stacked too closely, forklift traffic crossing pedestrian lanes, loading schedules that wasted nearly 45 minutes every morning. Without thinking, I grabbed a marker. Can I show you something? The warehouse manager shrugged. Sure. Within 20 minutes, we'd rearranged receiving assignments. Drivers stopped waiting. Dock congestion disappeared. One younger supervisor stared at me. How'd you see that so fast? I smiled. I loaded trucks before you were born. Victoria happened to arrive an hour later. The warehouse manager practically chased her down. Who is this guy? She looked at me. My friend. You should hire him. I'm retired, he laughed. Retired doesn't mean useless. That sentence stayed with me. For years, I'd quietly believed getting older meant becoming less valuable. Standing inside that warehouse, watching younger workers actually listening, I realized experience still counted. You just needed someone willing to notice. That evening, Victoria and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset. Neither of us talked much. Finally, she asked, how are you feeling? Tired. I meant emotionally. I smiled. I know. I thought for a moment. I still miss my son. She nodded. I believe that. I don't miss who he's become. No. I miss the little boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat after baseball practice. Victoria looked toward the yard. My husband used to say grief isn't only about death, What did he mean? You grieve people who are still alive. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence felt comfortable, almost healing. The next morning, Grace called before breakfast. I've got news. Good. Potentially. What happened? The U.S. Attorney's Office referred the financial records to federal investigators specializing in elder financial exploitation. I took a slow breath. So, this is officially bigger than a family dispute. Across the kitchen, Victoria quietly set down her coffee. She met my eyes. Neither of us smiled. We both understood the same thing. From this point forward, there would be no putting the Mercer family back together the way it used to be. By the time October rolled around, I had stopped waking up every morning expecting my life to go back to the way it had been. It wasn't going to. Some losses don't heal by disappearing. They heal because you learn to carry them differently. The federal investigation was moving quietly in the background. Grace kept reminding me not to expect dramatic arrests or television cameras. Real financial cases took time. Meanwhile, Ethan had a much more immediate problem. His development in Fishers was running out of money. The bank had scheduled a final investor presentation at a downtown Indianapolis hotel. If he secured one last round of financing, the project might survive. If he didn't, everything he'd built would begin falling apart. Victoria received an invitation because Hale Global Logistics had expressed interest months earlier in leasing warehouse and office space connected to the project. Originally, she had planned to send one of her vice presidents. Instead, she looked at me over breakfast. Would you like to come? I set my coffee down. Me. You're part of this. I don't want revenge. I know. I don't want to humiliate my son. You won't. She smiled gently. He'll do that himself if he keeps lying. The conference room at the JW Marriott Indianapolis overlooked the White River. I had driven past the hotel dozens of times over the years, but had never been inside. Everything looked polished. Glass walls, fresh flowers, coffee stations, expensive suits. Developers, bankers, attorneys, and investors shook hands while pretending not to judge one another. I suddenly felt very out of place. Victoria noticed. You loaded delivery trucks for 35 years. I did. You earned your place in rooms like this long before most of these people earned theirs. That helped more than she probably realized. We took seats near the back. Grace sat beside us with two neatly organized binders. Harold came too, though technically he had no reason to be there. I wanted to watch, he admitted. I figured as much. And somebody needs to make sure you don't apologize to your son halfway through. I wasn't planning to. Good. I was only 50% sure. He nodded. I know. The presentation began exactly at 10. Then Ethan walked onto the stage. For a second, I didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight. Too much. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. His expensive navy suit looked slightly loose around the shoulders. Stress had aged him. Part of me hated seeing that. Another part remembered sitting alone in Istanbul airport with no passport, no money, and no idea whether I'd even get home. Sympathy has limits. Ethan began confidently. Ladies and gentlemen, for 30 minutes he presented occupancy projections, revenue forecasts, and expansion plans. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed every word. The audience asked polite questions. Banks nodded. Investors took notes. Everything seemed to be going his way. Then one banker raised his hand. Mr. Mercer? Yes. We've recently received updated financial information. Ethan smiled. I'm happy to clarify anything. I'm sure you are. The banker looked toward Victoria. Our leasing committee has also received independent documentation. Ethan's smile weakened. What documentation? Grace quietly stood. Every head turned toward her. My name is Grace Hale. She introduced herself as corporate counsel for Hale Global Logistics. I've been reviewing the due diligence materials provided to potential investors. She paused. We found several discrepancies. The room became noticeably quieter. Grace never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She projected scanned documents onto the large screen. Original signatures, revised signatures, different dates, metadata, email records. Everything appeared side by side. Even I could understand it. One investor frowned. Those aren't the same files. No, Grace answered. They aren't. Another attorney leaned forward. Mr. Mercer, can you explain these alterations? Ethan looked directly at Grace, then at Victoria. Finally, at me. His face turned pale. Dad! I didn't answer. He looked almost relieved to see me, as if somehow I could still rescue him. The lead banker asked another question. Did you use assets controlled under power of attorney to secure project financing? Ethan hesitated. Those were family investments? Grace calmly slid another folder across the table. They were retirement assets belonging to Mr. Jack Mercer. Silence. The banker opened the folder. His expression changed almost immediately. Another investor quietly closed his notebook. One by one, people stopped taking notes. That sound, the soft click of notebooks closing, echoed louder than any shouting could have. Ethan's breathing became noticeably faster. "You don't understand." A developer interrupted him. "Then explain." "It was temporary." Someone else spoke. "You represented those funds as unrestricted personal capital." "They were." "They weren't." "No." He rubbed both hands across his face. "You don't understand the pressure." Nobody answered. Pressure wasn't a legal defense. At that moment, the conference room door opened again. Melissa walked inside. I hadn't known she was coming. Neither had Ethan. He stared at her. "What are you doing?" She walked calmly to the front of the room carrying a single envelope. She looked exhausted, but strangely peaceful. She handed the envelope to the lead attorney representing the lenders. "I believe these belong with the rest." Ethan whispered, "Melissa?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I begged you to tell the truth." "I was trying to save us." "You were saving yourself." No anger, no screaming, just disappointment. It somehow hurt more. The attorney opened the envelope. Additional emails, draft contracts, more revised documents. He quietly passed them to the bank representatives. One after another, investors began standing. Not dramatically, just leaving. One shook Victoria's hand before walking out. Another apologized for wasting everyone's morning. Within minutes, nearly half the room was empty. The presentation was over. Not officially. Reality had ended it. Ethan suddenly turned toward me. "This is what you wanted." I stood slowly. My knees reminded me they were 63. I walked to the front of the room, close enough to look my son directly in the eyes. "I wanted my son back." He swallowed. "You destroyed everything." I shook my head. "No." "You did." "No, Ethan." I kept my voice calm. "So listen carefully." The room was silent enough to hear the air conditioning. "Growing older didn't make me weak." I paused. "Loving you made me blind." His shoulders dropped. For the first time since this nightmare began, he had no argument, no clever explanation, no new lie, just silence. Behind us, two investigators approached the bank's legal counsel to begin collecting documents that had been voluntarily produced during the meeting. No one handcuffed Ethan. No dramatic scene unfolded. Instead, the process that would determine responsibility had quietly begun. Victoria touched my shoulder. "You ready to go?" I looked at Ethan one last time. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, spiritually. I realized something then. The man standing in front of me wasn't the little boy who used to ride his bicycle down our driveway. That child had been gone for years. I simply hadn't wanted to admit it. Without another word, I turned around and walked away. People ask me how the story ended. They're usually hoping for something dramatic. A prison sentence, a courtroom speech, my son begging for forgiveness. Real life almost never gives you endings that clean. Instead, it gives you Tuesday mornings. About 6 months after that meeting at the JW Marriott, I was standing in my backyard trimming the rose bushes Linda had planted years before. I wasn't very good at gardening. She used to tease me about that. "You can organize a garage with military precision," she'd say, "but somehow you always prune the wrong branch." She wasn't wrong. I smiled to myself and carefully clipped another stem. The phone rang. It was Grace. "Morning, Jack." "Morning. I thought you'd like an update." "I've been waiting." She had become part of my life in a way neither of us expected. Not just as Victoria's daughter or my attorney, but as someone who checked in simply because she cared. The civil case is finished. And the judge approved the settlement. I leaned against the fence. "Tell me the good news first." She laughed. "You got your house back free and clear." I closed my eyes. The mortgage Ethan had placed against it had been removed after the court found he had exceeded his authority and relied on misleading documentation. My home was finally mine again. What about the retirement accounts? We recovered most of them. Most, not all. She didn't sugarcoat it. Some of the money had disappeared into failed investments long before anyone realized what Ethan was doing. It couldn't be recovered. I took a slow breath. "I can live with that." "I thought you might." "What about Ethan?" There was a pause. "The criminal case is still moving through the system." I figured. He accepted responsibility for several fraud-related charges instead of taking everything to trial. That sounded like Ethan, even at the end trying to negotiate. He'll face the consequences. Yes, but the exact sentence is up to the judge. I understand. When we hung up, I sat on the back steps for a long time. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Not physically, emotionally. Anger takes a lot of energy to carry. Letting it go turns out to be exhausting too. A few weeks later, Victoria invited me to Chicago, not for business, for dinner. She had converted part of Hale Global Logistics into something I admired more than any warehouse or office building. A foundation that helped older Americans who had been financially exploited. Some had lost retirement savings. Others had signed documents they didn't understand. One gentleman had nearly lost his family farm. Listening to their stories was strangely comforting, not because I enjoyed hearing them, because I realized I wasn't the only one who had trusted the wrong person. Victoria introduced me to the group. This is Jack. No long speech, no list of what had happened, just, this is Jack. After the meeting ended, one man around my age stopped me near the coffee table. I heard part of your story. I nodded. My daughter took everything. I looked at him. I thought I was the only fool. You weren't. Neither was I. We stood there for nearly 20 minutes talking about grandchildren blood pressure medicine and how impossible it had become to find a decent hardware store. It felt wonderfully ordinary. For the first time in months, my past wasn't the most interesting thing about me. Victoria and I never rushed whatever was happening between us. Maybe that's because we were both old enough to know loneliness and love aren't the same thing. Sometimes we'd have dinner. Sometimes we'd spend an afternoon walking around the Indianapolis Museum of Art or the lakefront in Chicago. Sometimes we'd simply sit on my porch drinking coffee. Silence gets easier when you're with the right person. One evening, she looked toward Linda's garden. You still talk about her. I always will. I hope you do. I looked at her. That doesn't bother you, she smiled softly. My husband has been gone 11 years. She reached into her purse and showed me a faded photograph. I still talk about him. We both laughed. Growing older teaches you something younger people often don't understand. Love doesn't replace love. Your heart just somehow makes room. I saw Ethan only one more time. His attorney asked whether I'd be willing to meet before sentencing. I almost said no. Then I remembered something my father used to tell me. Never avoid a conversation you'll spend years replaying. So I went. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. He looked thinner than before. No expensive watch, no tailored suit, just a plain blue shirt and tired eyes. He stared at the table. I'm sorry. I waited. Nothing else came. Finally, I asked, what are you sorry for? He hesitated. I got carried away. No. He looked up. You made choices. Silence. I kept telling myself I'd fix everything before you noticed. I know. I never meant, his voice cracked. I never meant to leave you there. That sentence caught me off guard. Out of everything, that was what haunted him most. I believe you. You do. I believe you didn't wake up planning to abandon your father in an airport. I paused. But once you started making bad decisions, they got easier. He nodded slowly. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't. His face fell. Then I added, forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. He looked confused. I've let go of my anger. I stood. But I'll never again hand you responsibility for my life. He nodded. I understand. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Either way, the boundary was finally clear. Today, my life is quieter than it used to be. I volunteer twice a week with Victoria's Foundation, helping seniors understand basic financial documents before they sign them. Nothing complicated, just plain English. Sometimes all someone needs is another pair of eyes asking, have you actually read this? Harold still drops by every Saturday morning with donuts. Now we both read the labels before opening the box. He insists that's our new tradition. I think Linda would have laughed at that. The pencil marks inside my hallway closet are still there. So are the memories. Some painful, most beautiful. As for revenge, people think revenge means making someone suffer. I've learned something different. The greatest revenge is refusing to let someone else's betrayal become the rest of your story. My son took my passport. He almost took my retirement. He nearly took my home, but he didn't take the years I still had left. Those belonged to me, and finally, I started living them. If this story reminded you of someone you love or even of yourself, I hope it encourages you to ask one more question before signing anything and to protect your peace without feeling guilty. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I wish you good health and good people by your side.